Welcome to another Enphase API training video. In this video, we will discuss available data endpoints that are used with the Enphase API to access the details of an Enphase solar installation. See the video description in the links below for other API videos, including generating O authorization tokens, as well as choosing which API plan is best for your needs. For all homeowner, developer, and installer Enphase API data plans, once the access token has been generated, the following endpoints may be used to return system details in your API database applications. These endpoints are Systems, Search, Site ID, Summary, and Devices. Please note, these are data endpoints only. Any commissioning of API endpoints are only available on the installer plan, which must have a minimum of 10 installed sites. We will now go over what each data endpoint is used for and an example of what each one looks like. The first data endpoint is the system endpoint. This endpoint returns a list of sites or systems that the application in question has access to. This endpoint uses the GET request to pull the associated information and requires the API key for the application, as well as the bearer token generation for authorization. An example of the command and returned information is shown here. When inserted into your code, the endpoint will look similar to this. Some information has been redacted for security purposes. The next data endpoint is the search endpoint, which allows the user to search for systems based on the filters provided by the user. This endpoint uses the POST request to pull information and requires the API key for the application in question, as well as the bearer token used for the generation of authorization. An example of the command and returned information is shown here. When inserted into your code, the endpoint will look similar to this. Some information has been redacted for security purposes. The next endpoint is the site ID endpoint, which returns relevant information about the site requested, but not limited to the unique numeric ID for the system, the name of the system, both private and public if applicable, the time zone and location data for the system, the internet connection type, site status, and more. See the next section for the full list of information for this data endpoint. This endpoint uses the GET request and requires the API key for the application in question, as well as the bearer token generation for authorization. An example of the command request and returned response information is shown here. When inserted into your code, the endpoint will look similar to this. Some information has been redacted for security purposes. The site ID endpoint retrieves the following detailed information about a specific system identified by its system ID. Note, this information can also be seen in the developer installer portal itself. System ID shows the unique numeric ID of the system. Name shows the name of the system. Public name shows the site name displayed on the public systems page. The available values are all residential system, commercial, etc. The default type is residential system. This is only for systems that allow public access. Time zone shows the time zone to which the system belongs. City shows the city in which the system is located. State shows the state in which the system is located. Country shows the country in which the system is located. Postal code shows the postal code of the system's location. Connection type shows the connection type of the system. Available values are Ethernet, Wi-Fi, or cellular. Energy lifetime, energy today, and system size are all deprecated fields. The API will always return these fields as -1. Status will show the system status. Corresponding enlightened values can be found in the table that is added at the end of the page. Last report at shows the timestamp in which the system's gateway last submitted a report. Last energy at shows the timestamp in which the system's amount of produced energy was last reported. Even if the last produced energy is 0, the timestamp will be returned. Operational at shows the timestamp in which the system became operational. This corresponds to the system's interconnect time if one has been specified. Otherwise, it is the system's first reported interval end time. Attachment type shows the microinverter attachment type. Available values are rack mount, ZEP, a CM, BIPV, frame mount, or rail-less mount. Interconnect date shows the date on which the system was approved to connect to the grid. If the calling user belongs to a company and that company has provided its own identifier for a system, that ID is included here. Otherwise, this attribute is not returned. If any other companies have provided their own identifiers for a system, those identifiers are included here. Otherwise, this attribute is not returned. The next endpoint we will discuss is the summary endpoint. The summary endpoint is useful for getting a comprehensive overview of a specific system's performance and status. This request fetches details such as the number of modules, system size, current power output, energy produced today, total energy produced, and more. The next section will detail a full list of the information available. This endpoint uses the GET request and returns several pre-programmed data points for the system. This endpoint requires the API key for the application in question and the bearer token generation for authorization. An example of the command request and returned response information is shown here. When inserted into your code, the endpoint will look similar to what is seen here. Some information has been redacted for security purposes. The summary endpoint retrieves the following system details. System ID is the unique identifier for the system. Modules indicates the number of solar modules there are on the system. Size shows the total capacity of the system in watts. Current power shows real-time power output in watts. Energy today shows the total energy produced today in watt-hours. Energy lifetime shows the total energy produced since installation, also in watt-hours. Summary date is the specific date for which the summary data is provided. Status indicates the current operational status as normal, warning, or error. Operational since gives the timestamp of when the system became operational. Last reported at is a timestamp of the last data report received. The final data endpoint for this video is the devices endpoint. Use this endpoint to view all devices on the system and their relative data. This endpoint uses the GET request and returns all Enphase devices on the system, including all microinverters, meters, gateways, cell modems, Q relays, and Enphase batteries. This endpoint requires the API key for the application in question and bearer token generation for authorization. An example of the command request and returned response information is shown here. When inserted into your code, the endpoint will look similar to this. Some information has been redacted for security purposes. Here are more examples of what the return data will look like regarding the different devices on the system. Data is returned for all devices, including all microinverters, meters, Q relays, and batteries. Note, a site that currently has a battery not reporting error will show its status as end charge in the response. Thank you for watching another informative video from the Enphase team.